All right, so good to see everyone. Welcome. This is the second installment of the High Steps online series. Um, we are very happy today to welcome Adam Tuboly, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of Philosophy at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Adam is a philosopher of science with a wide range of interest. Many of his interests revolve around the history of philosophy of science and logical empiricism in particular. But he has worked also on several other issues, including the philosophy of pseudosciences, and he has published extensively, including a number of incredibly useful edited volumes. There's one handbook of the philosophy of the history of philosophy of science forthcoming with Routledge, if I'm not mistaken, that we have already mentioned it because we have already mentioned this project last time because Adam is co-editing this new volume, forthcoming volume with Flavia, who was our first speaker last month. So we are now very happy to leave the floor to Adam, who will talk about his most recent publication. I figure a beautiful book published by Cambridge University Press that he authored with Christopher Burke, titled Otto Neurath in Emigration. And Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm very happy that you are here as well. So thank you so much for this chance. At the beginning, Matteo has asked me to talk basically something about this book about Otto Neurath in Britain and some related philosophical, social, scientific, and other issues involved there. So I was happy to take the chance to talk a little bit about this book after all, which was published a few months ago. And the peculiarity about this issue, I think, is that, as Matteo said, I'm a historian of philosophy of science, or a historian of philosophy of science. And Christopher is a historian, intellectual historian, who works on the history of typography and design issues. So basically, we try to put together our different expertise and skills. So I tried to put in some philosophy of science and philosophy in general, and Chris put there a lot of intellectual history and visual education history and all that kind of stuff that is really important for isotype, as you might know. So the book is basically the joint effort of us bringing together different perspectives, different aims and expertise to produce something about Otto Neurath. So I would like to discuss these issues. The structure of the talk will be that I will talk a little bit about the motivation for writing this book at all. I will try to put in different motivations, not just to have a book, but why did he would like to write particularly this book. So there is some kind of publishing interest and philosophical points as well, I hope. And after discussing the motivation for the book, after which I really hope that you will also think that it's worth writing and now reading such a book about Neurath in Britain, I will really quickly summarize the different chapters and points to see the richness of Neurath's work in England, to get a general bird's eye view about what's contained in the book. And after that, I will try to present a general case study from this book, from different chapters together, to see what I think to be the most important, one of the most important philosophical or intellectual historical points about not just Neurath, but also logical empiricism as well in this context. So, first of all, why to write such a book? I mean, such a narrow book about Otto Neurath in Britain. Well, there is a very, very general motivation that you might share with us, I think. I take this quote from Johnston's very famous book, The Austrian Mind, where he says that in scope of interest, Neurath knew no rival in this century. Who else conducted original research in physics, mathematics, logic, economics, sociology, ancient history, political theory, history of German literature, architecture, and graphics? No other incarnated so boldly the Austrian talent for integrative thinking. And of course, you might add pedagogy, urbanism, planning theory, museology, linguistics, history of science, and philosophy as well. That is missing from Johnston's list. So the point is that Neurath was thought to be such an important integrative thinker, or polymath, if you wish, already many decades ago, and he still is regarded as such. So we thought with Christopher that it would be really important to take yet another biographical, intellectual, historical take on Neurath's life, because if somebody were doing so many things, we should see, understand, and know how did he do all that, and how did all these very different skills, expertise, and interests come together in one such bold giant, as he used to be called. So that's one very general motivation, that Neurath is a really fascinating thinker. I mean, this might be a matter of taste, of course. Carnap is interesting as very many levels, as it turns out, just as Philip Frank. But in a certain sense, Neurath was doing much more colorful, much more different things than all these other rather focused philosophers after a certain point. So in a certain sense, if we can see what did Neurath do and how did do all those things, for example, in Britain, we might get a much richer sense of what logical empiricism was, or at least could have been, if done fully by Neurath, for example, even in the 40s and 50s, after 45 when he died. Okay, the other motivation for the book was another general motivation, that there is basically, if you think about that, there is no literature on Neurath's life and achievements in Britain. So if you take a very famous book from Rainer Hexelmann, published in 1979, which was a collection of Neurath's socialist writings and other stuff there. And Hexelmann wrote a very famous, very long introduction about this. He summarized Neurath's lives and achievements and places somehow Neurath's theoretical and practical interests and achievements on a scale. And of course, he argues that there is a difference. How could you do such a practical stuff if you're a non-cognitivist, and that kind of stuff that is being questioned nowadays by Christian Dunberg? But out of the 71 pages, Hexelmann devotes only 1 page to Neurath's British life and achievement, and that's not much. There's also this book by Paul Neurath, Neurath's son, and Elizabeth Nemeth, which again contains a lot of papers of Neurath and stuff. And it also contains a quite long intellectual biography of Neurath written by his son, which is yet again 83 pages, and only 5 pages of that contains any information about what did Neurath do in England, what was the importance of that, and how he handled all those years. So yet again, not much. Again, if you take this, another very famous book written by Nancy Cartwright, Jordi Catt, Lola Fleck, and Tamas Tuboly, you might remember that the first part of the book was written by Lola Fleck. I guess it was the dissertation of Lola Fleck that was published here in a revised version, which is again a very long intellectual biography of Neurath's life. And again, from the 81 pages, only 3 pages concerns anything from Neurath's English years. So yet again, we see that like nothing happened in those 5 last years. And of course, the only exception would be Günther Sander's biography. And I just have to add that Günther Sander is just making a talk about Neurath just in this hour in Vienna. But I'm happy that you are here and not there. Thank you. So, but Günther Sander's biography is very long, very interesting, but there are 2 problems. One is it is in German, so most people will not really read it or not would be really interested in reading a long German biography. And that's a handicap for analytic philosophers, obviously. On the other hand, at least that book contains more than 30 pages of Neurath's British life, and some of them were translated into English and published separately in 2011 already. But that's still not that much of 300 pages that you just discussed, 30 pages, what Neurath did and achieved in Britain. So that's a quite relevant motivation, I would say, that seemingly nobody really cared about the British years, and we don't know much about what happened there. Of course, everybody knows that he emigrated there, he was interned there, he did the Isotype Institute, he published the foundations of social sciences, he died there, but beyond these very general things, we don't know much about what exactly happened there. There is another quite interesting motivation, I would say, from an intellectual historical point of view about how those 5 years were relevant for Neurath. And again, if you take the general view, we might know that he did the Isotype Institute, the Foundations of Social Sciences, he was interned, there was wartime, he was struggling a lot, quite obviously. So it might have been a quite bad last 5 years for Neurath, especially if you compare it to Red Vienna, where Neurath was thriving in so many ways and senses that he was one of the most important and famous figures in Red Vienna, and very often socialists from the United States traveled to Vienna just to observe Neurath's museums. We have quite a few reports published in the late 20s saying that I went to Vienna and I was especially interested in Neurath's famous museum. That's an achievement, of course. And that was Carnap's and Carnap's estimation of the situation, because right after Neurath died, and they wrote to Murray about their condolences, they wrote that the last years have not been easy for the two of you, and we always admired how courageously you took it. Not a single time has Neurath mentioned hardships in the life of England. He only wrote about finding new friends, reconstructing his work, enjoying life with you. So what's the implication here? It must have been bad. Surely it was bad for all of you. It must have been a struggling, suffering period. Yet you say nothing. It must have been bad. Well, when Mary Neurath replied to the Carnaps, she wrote that you have a very wrong impression if you think that just the last years were difficult for him. They were in fact the most successful of his life. And he stressed again and again how much he felt at home in this country. He had very good friends here and an extraordinary response. So basically, if you took this letter literally and seriously, that's not the picture we used to have about Neurath struggling through the last few years in England during wartime, not achieving many things. This is a quite different Neurath. And with Chris, we tried to take this very seriously and literally and try to find out how were these last few years that important and that successful and good for Neurath after all. So we tried to correct this public misunderstanding of Neurath's last few years, that it was not bad, it was not struggling, it was not unimportant, but quite the contrary. Yet again, many people would think that, well, if you take Neurath's corpus with regard to his publications, not many things have happened in Britain. If you see, this is the collected works, the new edition of the collected works of Otto Neurath, and basically more than 90% of the publications of Neurath were written before the British exile. So basically in Britain, most people would say or think that Neurath published basically almost nothing beyond the foundations of social sciences. So if you would like to understand Neurath's philosophical gist, even during these years, you have to turn to this huge collection of publications published previously to the British era, because in Britain, not much has happened. But that would be a little bit, not entirely, but a little bit misleading. So if you see here, Neurath had published, or at least tried to publish, quite a few works. Of course, in the right corner, you see Foundations of the Social Sciences, which is the most famous Neurath book from this period, in a certain sense. So that's one thing. We know that he finished from hieroglyphics to isotype in the late 40s, mid-40s, sorry. That was his projected book cover, but it was published only much later by Christopher Burke in the after 2000 something. But he has written the whole book before he died. There was another book called Visual Education, Humanization versus Popularization, another quite long book that was not published in his lifetime, but published in 1996 by Juha Manninen, who just passed away as far as I know. And there was a very small booklet called Memorandum on the Need for an Institute of Visual Education as an Instrument of International Understanding by Otto Neurath, supported by G.J. Wynand, Julian Huxley, and Lancelot Hogben, for example. That's a very small booklet from Neurath. The point here basically is that even though none of this is comparable to the big collection of Neurath's collected works, after all, but still, he was really thriving writing books and papers in the British era. Many of those papers remained unpublished, but they are to be found in the Neurath archive, and I guess most of them are online now in Christian Damberg's Wallep online archive as well. But the point is that Neurath was really writing a lot during this period, and he was writing very important autobiographies, books about philosophy of science, books about to experts and democracy and all these kinds of things. And yet again, this should be taken seriously, at least in our point of view, and we try to consider them seriously in the volume. The last thing to be mentioned here, which might be interesting, is that if you would like to write a general intellectual biography of anybody, the best would be if you were able to find any common topics that could be reconstructed from different angles throughout the entire life of your subject. And that started to be a little bit tricky for Neurath, because after all, you might consider something like physicalism, that is main topic of Neurath during all his life. But physicalism was not that prevalent before the Viennese years, the Vienna Circle. And he didn't talk, much about that during the English exile either. Socialization and the calculation debate and that kind of stuff was not that important after the Vienna Circle hit the stage, and he didn't talk much about that in the English exile either. So many of the most famous topics of Neurath were either none that important for his entire life, or were not important during the British exile. So what to do here, what to handle? And what we found with Chris is that still you can find some common topics that were equally important always and everywhere when Neurath was, be it Vienna, the Hague exile, and later the British exile. And these are planning and education. So planning as such, and the social and scientific importance of education were equally emphasized before the First World War, between the two wars, and even at the end of the Second World War. So we tried to use these two concepts in the book as our guiding sticks to understand Neurath's life and achievements, because planning and education were really, really important for Neurath, and especially important in the British era. And that's what Marie Neurath is referring to when she says that Neurath was the most successful in Britain. And basically, he was the most successful during his life in Britain, mainly because planning and education as two important topics for the British Marxist intelligentsia and others during the 40s. So in a certain sense, if you would like to push and far-fetch things a little bit, you might even say that the last 5 years of Neurath in Britain was even the peak of his career. And still, if it was the peak of his career, given that planning and education comes out the most obviously in those 5 years, why nobody has ever talked about the British years of Neurath? Okay, so these were the most important topics for motivations for the book. I hope now you would like to read this book, given the motivation, if you share them. Okay, so some of the themes of the book, just to get even more clear about the richness of Neurath's life and thinking during these last 5 years. So the book starts with some general chapters, which I would not talk about much. This is the introduction and prelude, which set the scene and discusses Neurath's achievements and ideas before 1934, when he emigrated to The Hague after the fascist takeover in Vienna. These are very general intellectual historical introductions to his thought and ideas. And I just put this photo here because that's the only photo where Neurath is in the middle and Philipp Frank is on the right. That's the only picture we have the two of them at the same time. The second chapter discusses Neurath's life and achievement during his 6 years in The Hague. And these years were important in a certain sense because Günther Sanders already showed this in different papers that Neurath was less political already in The Hague in a certain way. So given how active and how politically and socially active he was in Red Vienna, it is quite astonishing to see that he didn't do anything like that during his 6 years in The Hague. Also, his 6 years in The Hague has not been reconstructed that much so far in the literature, so we don't know a lot about what did he exactly do and where. But one hypothesis and interesting facts might have been to see how Neurath started already here to do some kind of internationalization of logical empiricism. That's the years when he started to organize the international congresses for the unity of science. These are the years when he contracted the Chicago Press for the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science. So what you see during these years in the Netherlands is that Neurath is really trying to make up a new network, trying to make up new connections, and trying to make logical empiricism seen as an international movement coming together with different peoples and different goals, and not just a Red Vienna part of socialist activist issue, after all. I don't know what's the exact explanation of that. As far as I know, what might be interesting is that there's a quite nice book published a few years ago about the history of the unified science and the unification, the idea of unification. And some people argue that the Netherlands were quite important in pushing neutralization and internationalization after the First World War to make new connections between French, Britain, and German scientists, for example. So many international movements appeared in the Netherlands after the First World War as they tried to be the engine of making peace and cooperation between different nations, the winners and the losers after the First World War. So that might come very close to what Neurath did here. And of course, these are the years when Neurath starts to go almost from year to year to the United States, and that's also very interesting. Then we discuss quite obviously the escape and internment of Neurath, and you can see the boat, the Zeemanschap, on which Neurath tried to go to Britain in 1940. This is the ship, and these are the houses, the type of houses in which he was interned for 8 months on the Isle of Man. And of course, this chapter reconstructs from steps to steps how he escaped The Hague, how he was and why he was interned, and how he got out from the internment camp, in which he was sharing houses with Friedrich Waismann, for example. It's not that much known that Waismann was also interned in 1940 in the same camp, the Onkan camp, in which Neurath was interned as well. And after the huge and very increased help of Susan Stebbing, he was able to leave the internment camp after 8 long months, and that was made possible also by a very kind letter of Albert Einstein, who wrote in favor of Neurath that no worries, he is an esteemed colleague of mine, he is to be trusted, and he should be out of the prison as soon as possible. And people who were dealing with these issues and writing papers to get people out claim that that's something because Einstein has made no other protest for anybody in those internment camps except for Neurath. That's also quite interesting. We also discuss how Neurath tried to settle down in Oxford, where he went after the 8 months of internment. And we discuss all his networks, because there was a quite huge and intensive German, Austrian emigrants societies and emigrant groups. A lot of people went to Oxford and Britain after German and Nazi persecution. And Neurath was quite thrilling because he knew most of these people from Vienna and from Berlin. So this already shows that he was quite happy to be there and wasn't lost, not even for a day, because wherever he went in Oxford and in London, he found similar faces from his
Perhaps.
Red Vienna years and days.
Right.
Hi. And also, he contacted inadvertently a lot of spies. So, I have a lot of German spies in London and Oxford. He didn't, possibly according to us, he not knew that they were spies, but he was in contact with a lot of spies after all. There is a quite interesting social niche that Neurath was attending, and that niche also helped him a lot settling down, making connections, connecting him to Paul Rota, for example, the filmmaker, and other people that many of these people even gave money to the Neuraths to rent a house and to restart the Isotype Institute and all his work about isotype and even publishing his books and stuff like that. What may be of some interest, of course, is Neurath's philosophical achievements and philosophical ideas in Oxford. This is also discussed in chapter 5, where we discuss how logical empiricism was getting to known in Britain by Stebbing, by Carnap, by Schlick's visit to London in 1932, for example, or 4, I can't remember, 2 or 4. And also Ayer's book on language, truth, and logic, and how all these books and publications and different correspondences try to make a good fertile soil for logical empiricism to receive there as well. And of course, the interesting thing is that if you think about that, neither Schlick's nor Carnap's conception of what philosophy and logical empiricism is was really close to how Otto Neurath conceived philosophy and what logical empiricism amounts to after all. So it's very interesting to see that even though there was a huge discussion of what logical empiricism is, what is verification, what is physicalism, and all those important topics in the 1930s, or the critics of metaphysics through syntax, for example, were not really of a much interest to Neurath during these years. So when he appeared in Britain, the British scene of philosophers knew many different things about logical empiricism that Neurath brought with himself to England as what logical empiricism is after all. And that's quite interesting to see how these different conceptions meet each other in various debates and lectures and publications, and how Neurath tried to change the estimation of logical empiricism after Ayer's attacks on everything, for example. So quite troubling after all for Neurath to clear the way to do real logical empiricism and not Ayer and all this other kind of stuff. Of course, these are the years, the most intense years when Neurath was dealing with semantics as well. You might know that he was attacking Carnap already in 1937 in the Paris Congress for Unity of Science, where Carnap was first presented after Tarski, his new semantic turn and semantic conception of truth, language, and meaning. And although Neurath was debating him already in the late 30s, it is 1941, 1942 when Carnap publishes the Introduction to Semantics, when Neurath really launches his attack against Carnap and against semantics, both in the correspondence and also in publications as well. And you also might know that this really hurt the relationship between Carnap and Neurath, given how, well, harshly Neurath treated Carnap, basically accusing him to be a Prussian totalitarian figure by doing semantics, a bad metaphysician after all. So that really hurted Neurath. And he did a lot to counter Carnap's influence during those years, as he already saw that Carnap's influence with semantics is really growing really quickly through such figures as Hempel and Feigl as well. And he even got some letters from America and books, which books claim that we see logical empiricism here on the rise in the United States, and we see also Otto Neurath, a very famous, good scholar, a pioneer in semantics. So the point here in this chapter as well which might be a quite nice topic for historical epistemology or whatnot as well, to see how the concept of semantics entered the scene in the 40s and how different people understood semantics differently. Because just as Neurath rejected semantics entirely, other people thought that Neurath was a pioneer in semantics because he was dealing with the word and not with terms and words, which is not true, of course, but it's a quite intense debate during these years, even especially with pragmatists in America with Carnap, seeing how semantics was unfolding in the 40s, meaning different things to different people. And of course, sometimes they joined each other because they thought they are doing the same things, like Morris and Carnap, but it always turned out that Morris is doing semantics in the sense of Neurath and not of Carnap. And that was also kind of a trouble between the relation of Carnap and Morris, for example. Of course, there's a lot of things to discuss about visual education that we does in chapter 7. So we discussed Neurath's contributions to the films of the years in the British war effort done by Paul Rota, how he did very important isotype work for social security and how to make popularly understandable the new taxes and new policies of British social thinking during the World War. These are also very important, and we discussed that, but it's much more social scientific issues than philosophical in that sense. And the last important things here are basically Neurath's papers about Plato and Nazism, which are not very well known nowadays, because most people would associate the debate against Plato, for example, and they relate this to Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies. Or some people would relate these discussions to Bertrand Russell in The History of Western Philosophy, where basically he says that, well, all these issues through Plato lead to communism. Of course, Popper connects these issues to Nazism, but these are the two main names. But it was in a certain sense Neurath already in 1944, so just before Popper and just before Russell did that, who tried to push this angle of understanding of Plato's influence on German thinking, that because of how German philosophers, especially in the 19th and 20th century, understood and utilized ideas taken from Plato, made a quite sensitive German atmosphere, as he says, the German atmosphere, to make Nazism and totalitarian ideas spread all over Germany, for example. And he did this in various publications with Joseph Loweris, who became a very important figure in the UNESCO after the Second World War. And they published all these papers in the Journal of Education. So that's, you see, the educational angle coming back even to the history of philosophy and how philosophical ideas might have a social influence in a certain context. And many people were debating Neurath, and they were arguing to save Plato from Neurath's accusations that Plato would have been an early totalitarian figure, a totalitarian social figure or public intellectual. And the dynamics of these debates are quite interesting because all these people like C.E. and Joad and others were defending Plato with just those totalitarian words and authoritative ideas that Neurath was attacking after all. So the dynamics were quite interesting there. And basically Neurath was quite unhappy with this issue because nobody jumped into these debates to take a stand with Neurath and Loweris against the Plato scholars of Britain. Nobody jumped in. Like 6 or 7 people published correspondence letters to the editor in these years. All of them went against Neurath and Loweris. Only one people jumped in to say that I am entirely in agreement with Dr. Neurath's views, but I am not going to say anything about that because I am just about to publish them in a separate book. And that one scholar was Bertrand Russell, after all. So Russell jumped in and said that I'm fully agree with Neurath, but I don't want to say anything because I'm just about to publish the history of Western philosophy in a few months. And in different letters, Neurath was thanking a lot of personal discussions with Russell about how German philosophers and continental thinkers influenced German and continental social totalitarian movements as well. So that's also quite an interesting issue after Neurath was attacking Russell for Russell's metaphysical semantical ideas in his book that was published in 1944, Truth and Knowledge or Interpretation. I can't recall the title, sorry. So after that, Russell was still taking a stand with Neurath against everybody else in Britain. So that's quite an issue there. The 9th chapter is basically about the economic ideals of Neurath and how they changed in Britain. I will talk about this in a moment. And of course, we discussed the Bilston experiment where Neurath was trying to make some very interesting isotype charts and practice isotype and philosophy as a democratic ideal in Bilston to find out how to rehabilitate that city and rebuild its houses. And of course, the book is closed with a coda discussing the relevance of Neurath and some further historical issues after he died, just after he died. Basically, that's the book. And I hope you can see from this very loose presentation that there is indeed a lot of themes and topics to be discussed in the context of Neurath just from those 5 years that he was in Britain. And I think that's quite a rich material that there is in the archives, basically, and in the published materials as well regarding what Neurath did and what different things from economics to democratic planning to sociology to philosophy to filmmaking and so on and so forth. And just to give you one case study for the last 10 to 15 minutes, I will present some ideas about how in general Neurath has changed his view on philosophy and logical empiricism when he entered the British Muddle. So the starting point, which would be very interesting or important, I think, is that if you take the early Vienna Circle, what you find there is just fight, and fight everybody basically. They had a lot of isms about anti-something, anti-metaphysics, anti-religion, anti-nationalism, anti-university, anti-everything. And if you check the manifesto as well, it's just a very interesting practical call to arms. So it says, to all friends of the scientific world conceptions, we live in a critical situations, we united with leading minds of our age, we invite those who recognize the same struggle and would like to fight with us. So there's a lot of fight in the 30s in the Vienna Circle. And Neurath was quite explicit. So in the paper on protocol statements, when he discusses Carnap's own phenomenalistic ideas on protocol sentences, basically he wrote that these remarks might induce younger people to search for this protocol language, and this easily leads to metaphysical digressions. Although metaphysics essentially cannot be defeated by arguments, it is important for the sake of the vacillators to press for physicalism in its most radical version. So what is hinted here basically is that if there is a topic that might induce a little bit somebody to go into the direction of metaphysics, you cannot discuss that. You cannot talk about that. You should not publish about that because there might be detrimental consequences if you talk about a phenomenalistic protocol language and it would lead somebody to metaphysics. Don't do that. So basically, Neurath was trying to forbid Carnap what to publish and what to think about and what not. And that's quite a fight attitude in a certain sense. And that's happened all over the place in the 30s with Neurath. So when certain people try to scientifically understand, evaluate, and even criticize, for example, parapsychology in the 20s, there were a lot of different scientific communities joined and even led by Hans Hahn, for example. Karl Menger recalled that Neurath said to him that only uncritical, run-down aristocrats and a few supercritical intellectuals such as Hahn would investigate parapsychology. And these were a lot of debates even with Hahn and Carnap that they should not even scientifically evaluate and criticize parapsychology, because if they do that, and these are quite familiar ideas from nowadays if you think about that, if you talk with those people, you would put them on an equal footing like scientists, and now you have created such an atmosphere in which parapsychology could show itself as being discussed by scientists, so it's a good thing. But Neurath tried to forbid that as well. A lot of fight going on there. And it's not just Neurath, but even Philip Frank wrote in 1934, after Hahn has died, that the Vienna Circle is the shock troop, the Stoss troop of the anti-metaphysical and consistently minded research movement. And just to recall your ideas about what the Stoss troop was in the First World War and in 1934, so they were the quite leading elite fighting parts of the army that went directly beyond the lines, the front lines, and tried to achieve something. So talking about the Vienna Circle as being the Stoss troop, the shock troop of the anti-metaphysical movement, is quite a statement, especially seen from nowadays. But I guess it would have been quite shocking to see already in 1934. So this was the old Vienna Circle that is very familiar to everybody, I guess, to fight everybody, to fight everything, and to go home. And you can see the very same thing when Neurath tried to debate with Karl Mannheim as well. So after Mannheim published Ideology and Utopia in 1930 as one of the founding documents of sociology of knowledge, in which Mannheim was trying to push the idea that even the conceptual categories and ideas we use are somehow existentially determined and related to our situation, and the social condition influences everybody everywhere, of course, except for the intelligentsia, but that's a different point. But this is a very important founding document. And you might know that Neurath immediately reviewed it, called it in the review as the bourgeois Marxism. And basically he was just attacking Mannheim, especially Mannheim's idea of the relatively classless stratum, the socially unattached intelligentsia. And he even says that one can largely explain Mannheim's total orientation in terms of his bourgeois metaphysical position. And the ending of the review says, yet again in very fighting terms, that yes, at the end of the day, here lies the major contrast. Mannheim seeks the all-encompassing view, an angle on the whole world, that is to say, metaphysics. Marxism, in contrast, seeks to make accurate statements concerning social processes. It wants to predict the future fate of the proletariat and other classes. Metaphysics versus science. In the end, and despite all his kindness, Mannheim versus Marxism. The bourgeois front versus the proletarian front, it's the old familiar tune. So that's quite a fighting, sounding like review against Mannheim. And that didn't change for a while. So when Charles Morris suggested Neurath in 1937 to include Mannheim or his colleague Louis Wirth to write the sociological volume for the encyclopedia, Neurath replied that, could you send me a book or an article of Wirth? I have not read the last book of Mannheim. An older book of Mannheim is what I would call full of metaphysical formulations. But perhaps I would revise my opinion after my USA trip. I learned not always to act as a Torquemada, the Inquisitor. And the last book that Neurath didn't, of course, what is full of metaphysical formulations is the Ideology and Utopia. And what Neurath didn't read is the Mensch und Gesellschaft im Zeitalter des Umbaus, published in 1935, that was published in Britain as Man and Society in an Age of Reconstruction in 1940. So Neurath was still thinking about Mannheim as somebody doing metaphysical issues, not to cooperate with and not to invite for the encyclopedia after all. But things will slowly change. I am at 40. Can I have 10 more minutes and I'm done very quickly? Thank you. Sorry.
Please go.
Thank you. So in 1939, Neurath, something happened. Later, Neurath wrote to Mannheim that he was really happy to see Mannheim's, as he says, I remember very well your appreciation of our activities in the publisher's information sheet on Modern Man in the Making. As you might know, Neurath published Modern Man in the Making in 1939, which was quite a big deal, sold in many copies. It was advertised all over the place. It was published in many, many newspapers in America. This advertisement is taken from an American newspaper, for example. It was quite a big deal. And it turns out that somehow, somewhere, Karl Mannheim has written like a positive review or a positive recommendation, something like a blurb for Neurath's book. We don't know that with Chris. We were not able to track down anything like that, but there are at least two letters in where Neurath thanks Mannheim his kind words in the information sheet. So somehow Mannheim was acting very kindly on Neurath and recommending his work. Neurath invited Mannheim everywhere. He invited Mannheim to the Harvard Congress of Unity of Science, next year to the Chicago Congress of Unity of Science, and in 41 to Neurath's own Oxford terminology workshop, which was really important, organized together with Stebbing and Laugeris. He even invited Mannheim there. Mannheim never went to any of these conferences. He always said that he would go. He even proposed topics. He was very enthusiastic. But as you can see in this letter as well, he always had something else to do, and he was very sorry he cannot go to any of these conferences. So it means that Neurath and Mannheim didn't meet until at least 1942, but they were in quite close correspondence for a few years. And already in 1942, Neurath was accepting Mannheim for the encyclopedia. He wrote in very cautious terms, it's very funny to read, that I should like to meet you as far as our encyclopedia is concerned. It is not urgent. You see, we are now publishing the first 20 monographs, but on the other hand, we have to prepare carefully the next 62, and I should like to know a little what, in principle, of course, you would perhaps assumed you will have time, write on your own opinion as a representative one. So not is it trying to be careful, dancing around Mannheim to somehow accept and invite him to really write a monograph for the encyclopedia after all, even though possibly it would take many years until they finish the first 20. Of course, I didn't know it would take 20 years, but it's a different point. But he was inviting him. One of the motivation was given to Carnap, saying that I am collecting material on the second series of monographs, and I am preparing a survey on people who are related to us, but have some whims, as it were. They should have an opportunity to express themselves with intensity. The first series of monographs stresses what we have in common. So the idea was that the first 20 monographs were written only by close friends and colleagues who were really pushing the idea of unified science, but Neurath saw the need to open up the project in the next 60 monograph to even those people who are not as close as logical empiricist friends are, but still could contribute something important to the cause of making science available for the public and making science available for scientists as well. So that might be the motivation why Mannheim was getting close to writing a book for Neurath in the encyclopedia, which, as you might know, never happened after all. Of course, there is a quite interesting practical attitude here. I will skip now. Neurath just simply says that, well, the problem with Reichenbach is not that he is having different views on science, explanation, systems, philosophy, whatnot, but that he is acting not kindly. But I fear him not as a scientist or debater, but as a person who is not interested in creating brotherhood in this world. And seemingly, Mannheim was somebody for Neurath who also had theoretical differences, but they were very easy going in their correspondence, sharing a lot of emotions, ideas about democracy, Europe, and so on and so forth. So this practical attitude, how to cooperate in the world of the war, is much more important than simply making scientific philosophical arguments so seriously. That was much more important, for example, for Carnap, who would really take seriously all different theoretical ideas. Those were not that important for Neurath after all. He even wrote to Mannheim that, you see, I think it is important that we try to be as cooperative as possible when promoting democracy. That is just the point, to cooperate as much as possible. That does not imply that one reduces difference in opinion. You might simply say now that all these are just biographical ideas, how to cooperate, building networks, but that would not be entirely true. We have the notes of Neurath from his Oxford course on logical empiricism and the social sciences, and those notes are filled with ideas that logical empiricism is a comprehensive scientific attitude, And we are talking about different statements that we are prepared to accept in this behavioral terminology. Science is about our way of speaking, language is a way of communication, not a picture of the world, as you might imagine, positivist and semantical ideas. But the most important thing is that conventions dealing with scientific language, therefore we make proposals how to create language. We are engaged to execute such proposals and are pleased to find people who are prepared to play on the same platform of communication as we do ourselves. No play without partners. And all these lecture notes are filled with ideas about proposals, about conventions, about promoting cooperation, and how logical empiricism as a general framework is the best tool to make proposals, to make cooperation possible, to act as a general unifying framework of communication, of analysis that could be accepted basically by everybody around these scientific issues, because you can cooperate as logical empiricist, but you cannot cooperate as a British idealist who are having much more stricter theoretical ideas that are narrowing down their possible paths of argumentation and cooperation. So Neurath was promoting logical empiricism as a way of making proposals, as a way of pushing different type of cooperations with everybody. And that's what you can see in Neurath's life in Britain, how he reached out to the most diverse people, be them educationalists, economists, sociologists, philosophers, politicians, policymakers, and whatnot, because he thought that only if we can get all these people together somehow would we achieve anything within science and society. That's not Carnap's attitude in a certain sense, but that was the attitude of Philip Frank, who did exactly the same thing in the 40s and 50s in the Institute for the Unity of Science in the United States. That's a quite nice parallel between Neurath and Frank, and that's why we are writing now Philip Frank biography as well, because the same engines are working there in different contexts after all. Of course, Neurath was also promised Mannheim to write a book, and the book, you know, from 1996, The Visual Education and Humanization, was the book that Neurath promised Mannheim to write for Mannheim's International Library of Sociology and Social Reconstruction. And that was one of the most important or sad missed opportunities of Neurath, because this International Library of Sociology and Social Reconstruction that was edited by Mannheim after 1942 was the most important British sociological achievements of the years. So some people wrote in 1947 that the book series have proved to be one of our most profitable publishing undertakings, and the demand for volumes in this country has steadily increased and continues to increase, even now when there is a marked decline in the demand for more ephemeral works. And even in 2014, a historian said that the serious books were an important part of what there was to read, and their dark green dust jacket made what people in Britain thought a sociology book looked like. Whether they are dark green or not is a different question, but it was an identity book in a certain sense. If you had a book in this series, you were accepted by the community of social scientists, and even the public would know that you have made an important achievement within social thinking because you appeared within this book series that Mannheim edited. So if Neurath would have written this book in his lifetime entirely and submitted to Mannheim, which they discussed in many letters, it might have been a counterfactual history, of course, what would have happened to Neurath within social sciences and within the philosophy of social sciences as well. Okay, I will have to skip, I think, this stuff now, but the last point would have been that at some point, Neurath got to know Mannheim's Man and Society in an Age of Reconstruction, and they started some kind of an indirect debate about that, because Neurath found a lot of important ideas in Mannheim. And for example, that was new to me as well, that Mannheim was evidently advocating planning in his British years, basically planning for freedom, and he argued that you can have planning and democracy and freedom at the same time, so you don't have to take the fears of Hayek and others so seriously, because you can have democratic freedom and you can also have some kind of fallibilism. And if you see, Mannheim wrote that figuratively speaking, reconstructing a changing society is like replacing the wheels of a train while it is in motion, rather than rebuilding a house on new foundations. So this is really close to Neurath's famous boat simile on rebuilding your boat on the open sea. So there were a lot of common themes for Mannheim and Neurath in these British Marxist discussions of planning, democracy, and freedom. We know that Neurath read some of these works. He even commented on the margins of this work. There were some divergences between them, of course, some differences of opinion that are not important for us. He also read the Diagnosis of Our Time, another major important work of Mannheim about planning, and he also made a lot of marginalia there about their similarities and differences. So they were quite close to each other. And we might take that Man and Society had a long chapter called Planning for Freedom, and Neurath's most famous paper in these years are International Planning for Freedom, published after Mannheim's book. So there might be some interesting connections perhaps between Neurath's paper and Mannheim's book as well that we are trying to discuss with Chris in this book. You can come down this. I'm a scientist. It's a film proposal that Neurath made about how to show what science is to the public. But to get to the conclusion, what's really important here from a philosophical point of view, I think, is that logical empiricism for Neurath in the 40s was less competitive, was less provocatory, was less fighting. This was a new logical empiricism. Logical empiricism was now making ideas compatible with everybody, making connections, cooperations, making proposals. And that's because, of course, even the cultural situation in Britain was less competitive in a certain sense. If you are finding yourself in the liberal British model of democracy, you don't have to fight everybody to achieve something. Basically, you can now just simply sit down and writing something important that will be important for the public, making connections. You don't have to fight religion, you don't have to fight metaphysics, because all those things are either non-existent in the British culture at that time, or were already, or other people like Mannheim and others in the 30s and 40s, Bernal and others, were already made those fights with other people. So Neurath, when he entered Oxford, was find a really relaxed situation. And I think that should be the topic of a nice social history of analytic philosophy, to see how the different, really different social contexts changed philosophical ideas. Because in a different social context in Red Vienna, you do a very different type of philosophy than you do in the British model of the 40s, in the democratic settings of Britain, in which you would go nowhere basically with just fighting everybody. And that's the final point. It was recognized even by Neurath in a certain sense. When he was discussing with Hans Reichenbach's brother, Bernhard Reichenbach, the socialist Bernhard Reichenbach, was also an exile in Britain, why he is not read, quoted, cited, and discussed that much as he would expected it. Basically, he said that social science and all the stuffs are very conservative. If you make something new in the social sciences, as scientists, people would not like you because they are much more, as Kuhn would say, paradigm driven, so to say. In philosophy, it's different. And Neurath wrote, you see, the philosophers are always of different opinions. The zoo of philosophers is a collection of cranks plus some not cranks, sometimes very wise cranks. Therefore, to have peculiarities is an advantage in this field. The more different, the better for being quoted. Comic situation. The point is, Neurath was not a crank in Britain after all. He was very much fitted all the British philosophical, social, scientific, and even social context of those wartime years. And that's why he was so successful as a public intellectual after all, and was not so successful as a philosopher in a certain sense, because he was not making very unique, very radical, very crank-like points and arguments. And of course, Ayer did, and Ayer win at the end of the day in a certain sense in the British context. When you think about what logical empiricism is, it was not Neurath, it was Ayer in a certain sense. So that might also contribute somehow to the decline of British logical empiricism. Sorry, thank you so much. I didn't misused my time and your patience. Thank you so much.